Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi. This week in my Prince Eye on China column, I wrote on the prevailing discourse on the China Philippines tension in the South China Sea and how this is being viewed within the Chinese strategic community as well as Chinese media and Chinese social media. The trigger for the latest round of tensions between China and the Philippines was this June 17th incident where a Filipino sailor sustained serious injuries when his vessel was rammed by the Chinese Coast Guard during a resupply mission to troops that were stationed on the second Thomas Shoal. That's a disputed submerged shoal between China and the Philippines. So now what we are seeing that the increasingly the South China Sea is being addressed as the next flashpoint in the Indo-Pacific. And this also explains how there is increasing consensus that the next conflict is going to be the South China Sea and not the Taiwan Strait, as opposed to the prevailing discourse and view that we keep hearing that how China is going to invade Taiwan in the near future. So definitely the recent tensions tell us that perhaps the next conflict could be in the South China Sea. And this is primarily because there have been several standoffs and confrontations that any of it could lead to miscalculation and thereby a full-fledged confrontation between China, Philippines, and thereby China and the United States. I believe there's still some restraint in the Taiwan Strait, but the intensity of confrontation is definitely becoming greater and higher in the South China Sea. So now going back to the 17th June clash, the Filipino sailor lost his thumb, and the Philippines accused China of intentional high-speed ramming. So the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs countered it by saying that the Philippine vessel was illegally intruding into the waters around the second Thomas Shoal. And a Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson also called this Philippines resupply mission as a dual purpose mission, which is more about supplying construction material, weapons, and equipment. But remarkably, China is framing the Philippines as provocative and accusing the country of actions like what China has been doing, its own decade long strategy in the South China Sea. And the activities such as constructing artificial islands and militarizing the disputed seas. This is something that China has been doing and now accusing the Philippines of doing exactly the same thing. This actually depicts that China is trying to establish a lopsided narrative where the Philippines is a provocatory party, is provocating China, and Beijing is a victim here. And this is just not limited to the government, but a broader narrative, cognitive warfare is also being played out in Chinese media as well as social on several social media platforms. So there is a widespread discussion on the killing of two Chinese citizens in the Philippines, and there is an attempt to paint a picture of the country as plagued by high crime rate as well as unsafe conditions for Chinese nationals. And much of this discussion is in Mandarin, so that also tells us that the audience for such discussion is a domestic audience, as aimed at influencing domestic audience against the Philippines, and also portray that Philippines is kind of inferior to China, and if there is a conflict between China and the Philippines, Philippines stands no chance in a fight against China. Then the discourse in the strategic community is also similar to what the Chinese Communist Party line has been with respect to the dispute with respect to the Philippines. And there are attempts to place the blame on the Philippines for escalation of tensions, and that it is Manila that is being aggressive, undermining the ASEAN unity, and not adhering to the declaration on the code of parties in the South China Sea, which is, by the way, legally non binding. So, the discourse in China also tells us that there is a belief that resolution is primarily unattainable because of the Philippines' action, and there are tension, there is escalation of tension primarily because of Philippines' action. So, this also tells us that China is definitely not taking any responsibility. There's no accountability from the Chinese side. And of course, the discourse in China also tells us what the government line is and how the government is also thinking. And sometimes we also see when we analyze Chinese discourse something that the government has been doing but not overtly saying. So I think this is very important that we analyze the Chinese discourse specifically in the South China Sea and how the Philippines, the dispute, and Southeast Asia are being viewed within China. Now, the US influence in the Philippines regarding the South China Sea matter, the issue is also an issue that is of considerable discussion and attention in China. Of course, the US has been getting a lot of attention within the Chinese discourse and with respect to South China Sea, there is this view that the US is using the Philippines as a tool, as a pawn to undermine China's regional influence. And this view is rather prevalent on multiple platforms. So, in fact, some have also argued that the South China issue is not the main issue of contention between China and the Philippines. Rather, it is Filipinos' president unabashed alignment with the US that is causing problems between China and the Philippines. Then apart from the US, there is another aspect of the discourse that I feel that kind of merits attention. uh, and this aspect is about Japan's ongoing effort and involvement in the South China Sea and the greater role that it is playing in the South China Sea. It is particularly Japan Philippines Defense and Security Cooperation that is leading this discussion towards a conclusion that there is a likelihood of Japan's further assistance to the Philippines and perhaps potential involvement of Japan in the dispute. But if we analyze and if we have a broader perspective of what is being discussed within China and the discourse surrounding the South China Sea, we would realize that this is the discourse, the discussion around South China Sea is a little bit lopsided. And in fact, it is a little bit ironical that when the Philippines is cooperating with the US, it is being seen as confrontational and provocative. But when it is trying to engage and have a dialogue with China, it is being projected as weak. And one example of that is the recently concluded ninth China Philippines bilateral consultation mechanism on the South China Sea. So instead of appreciating Manila for engaging in dialogue with China, trying to diffuse tensions, there have been several articles and posts on multiple platforms that have argued that Manila is primarily reaching out to China because there is lack of trust in the US and Manila, that the Philippines hasn't really got much out of the West, and this is one of the reasons why they have to diffuse tensions with China. And then there is also a realization that China's patience with the Philippines is now nearing its end. So, therefore, this is prompting Manila to reassess its approach and bolster its outreach to Beijing. But all this narrative building on Chinese social media and on strategic community circles, it definitely tells us that it closely aligns. If you look at the type of discussion and the argument that have been coming out of the Chinese strategic community and media, it definitely aligns with the government stance. And the broader discourse remains lopsided. It lacks analysis from the Philippines perspective, and now it also fails to address broader regional concerns and implications. This also signals a sharper turn towards fueling cognitive warfare in the South China Sea, where not only the government and military are at loggerheads, but the strategic community and social media warriors or influencers are playing an instrumental role in China's South China Sea strategy. Thank you, and I will see you next week.